The moment Mark Stevens denied my bereavement leave to attend my 4-month-old niece's funeral, I knew our relationship had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What he didn't know was that I'd already discovered his affair with Jessica from accounting, memorized his phone password, and was about to send his wife the one text message that would destroy his perfect suburban life forever. My name is David Martinez, 29 years old, and until that Wednesday morning in November, I was a senior project coordinator at Meridian Construction Management in Phoenix. I'd worked there for 4 years, building highways and office complexes across Arizona, while Mark systematically destroyed every ounce of respect I'd once had for authority. But when he chose to protect his weekend golf plans over my family's grief, he gave me the perfect excuse to do what I'd been planning for months. The burner phone was already in my car. His wife's number was already programmed. All I needed was the right moment to press send on the message that would teach him the difference between power and consequence. What Mark didn't understand was that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. And some employees, when pushed too far, stop caring about consequences altogether. The tragedy that started everything happened on a Tuesday morning in early November. My sister Carmen called me at 6:47 a.m., her voice breaking as she tried to explain that baby Sophia, her 4-month-old daughter, had died during the night. Sudden infant death syndrome. No warning, no explanation, just a healthy baby girl who went to sleep and never woke up. I was at the construction site when the call came, reviewing blueprints for a strip mall project that suddenly seemed utterly meaningless. Carmen could barely speak through her sobs, but she managed to tell me that the funeral would be Friday, and she needed me there. Sophia was my goddaughter, the first baby in our family in over a decade, and Carmen had been like a mother to me since our parents died in a car accident when I was 16. "I'll be there," I promised her, my own voice thick with emotion. "Whatever you need, Hermana. I'll handle everything here and drive down Thursday night." The 3-hour drive to Tucson seemed reasonable for a family emergency. I'd already worked 53 hours that week, had vacation days saved up, and hadn't missed a single day of work in 8 months. This was exactly the kind of situation where any decent human being would show compassion and flexibility. Mark Stevens was not a decent human being. I found him in his office at 8:30 a.m., reviewing contractor schedules with his typical self-important intensity. Mark was 42 years old, married to a school teacher named Linda, father to twin 8-year-old boys who occasionally visited the office during school breaks. He drove a new BMW, lived in a gated community in Scottsdale, and had spent the last 4 years reminding everyone that his MBA from Arizona State made him uniquely qualified to manage people who actually knew how to build things. "Mark, I need to talk to you about this Friday," I said, standing in his doorway. He didn't look up from his papers. "What about Friday?" "My niece died last night. The funeral's Friday afternoon in Tucson. I need to take Thursday and Friday off to be with my family." That's when he finally looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that I had never noticed before. Not sympathy or concern, but calculation. He was weighing my personal tragedy against his own convenience, and I could see which way the scales were tipping. "That's unfortunate," he said, his tone suggesting it was about as unfortunate as a traffic jam. "But we've got the Morrison project review Friday morning, and the clients specifically requested you be there. Can't someone else handle the funeral arrangements?" I stared at him, trying to process what I'd just heard. "It's my goddaughter, Mark. She was 4 months old. This isn't about arrangements. It's about being there for my sister." "Look, David, I understand family obligations, but we also have professional obligations. The Morrison Review represents a potential $12 million contract. Your personal situation, while regrettable, can't take priority over company commitments. Something shifted inside me in that moment. Not anger exactly, something colder, more focused. I'd known Mark was selfish and arrogant, but this revealed a level of callousness that genuinely shocked me. He was treating my goddaughter's death like a scheduling inconvenience. "You're telling me I can't attend my niece's funeral because of a client meeting?" "I'm telling you that we all make sacrifices for success. Sometimes personal desires have to take a backseat to professional responsibilities." Personal desires. He'd just described attending my 4-month-old goddaughter's funeral as a personal desire. What if I find someone to cover the Morrison Review? Mark shook his head. "The clients specifically requested you. Your reputation is what got us this opportunity in the first place. I can't risk having them feel like we're sending second-string talent." The irony was incredible. My competence had created an opportunity for the company, but that same competence now meant I couldn't take time off when my family needed me most. I was being held hostage by my own professional success. "Mark, this is my goddaughter's funeral. Some things are more important than business." His expression hardened. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people stuck in middle management, David. Successful people understand that sacrifice is required for advancement. I've missed family events for business reasons. It's part of being a professional." I wanted to point out that Mark's definition of missed family events probably meant arriving late to his son's baseball game because he was playing golf with potential clients. But I also realized that arguing was pointless. He'd already made his decision, and my personal tragedy was simply not important enough to change his mind. "So that's final? No time off for the funeral?" "I'm afraid so, but I'll tell you what, take Monday off instead. A long weekend after the Morrison Review. Think of it as a mental health day." A mental health day, 4 days after my goddaughter's funeral. As if grief operated on a convenient schedule that aligned with business priorities. I nodded once and walked out of his office without another word. But as I returned to my desk, something had fundamentally changed. Mark Stevens had just shown me exactly who he was, and I was about to show him exactly who I could become when pushed too far. What Mark didn't know was that I'd been documenting his affair with Jessica from accounting for the past 3 months. It started accidentally. I'd been working late one Thursday evening, finishing cost estimates for a shopping center project, when I heard voices from the conference room. Mark's voice specifically, along with a woman's laugh that definitely wasn't his wife's. I wouldn't have thought much of it, except that everyone else had left hours earlier, and the woman's voice belonged to Jessica Morrison, our 26-year-old accounting coordinator, who'd been hired 8 months earlier. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked past the conference room and glanced through the glass door. Mark and Jessica were sitting closer than any business discussion required, and Mark's hand was resting on her thigh in a way that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. I kept walking, but my mind was racing. Mark Stevens, the family man who kept framed photos of his wife and kids on his desk, was apparently having an affair with an employee young enough to be his daughter. The man who constantly lectured about professional standards and appropriate workplace behavior was violating both in the most obvious way possible. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. Mark and Jessica would stay late together twice a week, always when the office was nearly empty. They'd take business lunches that lasted 3 hours and returned with Jessica's lipstick slightly smudged. Mark would find excuses to visit the accounting department that had nothing to do with his actual responsibilities. But the most damning evidence came from Mark's own carelessness with technology. He was constantly checking his phone during meetings, typing messages with the intensity of a teenager. One day in early October, I was sitting across from him during a staff meeting when his phone buzzed with a text notification. The message preview was visible from where I sat. "Can't wait for tonight, baby. Same hotel as last week. The sender was listed as J. Morrison in his contacts. That's when I realized Mark wasn't just having an affair. He was having an affair with someone whose last name was Morrison, the same name as our potential $12 million client. Jessica Morrison wasn't just an accounting coordinator. She was the daughter of our biggest prospective client, and Mark was risking the company's most important contract for a sexual relationship with someone barely out of college. The more I learned, the more disgusted I became. Mark would leave early on Fridays, claiming client development activities, then spend the afternoon at expensive hotels with Jessica, while his wife thought he was working late to provide for their family. He'd use company credit cards to pay for their lunches, then categorize the expenses as client entertainment. He'd even started bringing Jessica to client meetings, introducing her as his special assistant, while his wife stayed home with their twin sons. But what truly sickened me was watching Linda Stevens at company social events. She'd arrive looking proud and supportive, praising Mark's dedication to his career while he flirted openly with Jessica right in front of her. Linda would talk about how hard Mark worked, how many sacrifices he made for their family's future, while the object of his actual attention stood 20 feet away, laughing at his jokes and touching his arm in ways that should have been reserved for his wife. I started documenting everything, not for any specific purpose initially, just because Mark's hypocrisy was so flagrant that it seemed important to have evidence. I took photos of them leaving the office together, copied their email exchanges that passed through the company server, and even recorded a few conversations when they thought they were alone in the break room. But I never planned to use any of it. Mark was a terrible boss and a worse husband, but destroying someone's marriage felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross. The information was insurance, nothing more. Something to protect me if Mark ever tried to retaliate for my knowledge of his indiscretions, until he refused to let me attend my goddaughter's funeral. That's when everything changed. That's when Mark's personal failings became relevant to my professional situation. That's when I realized that someone who would destroy his own family for sexual gratification and deny his employee bereavement leave for convenience wasn't someone who deserved protection or loyalty. I called in sick Thursday morning and drove to Tucson anyway. The funeral was devastating in the way that only a child's funeral can be. Carmen looked like she'd aged 10 years in 3 days, and her husband Miguel could barely hold himself together as we carried that impossibly small white casket to the gravesite. Sophia had been the light of their lives for 4 months, and now she was gone without explanation or warning. I delivered the eulogy because Carmen couldn't speak and Miguel couldn't stop crying. I talked about Sophia's smile, about the way she'd grab my finger with her tiny hand, about the future she'd never have and the joy she'd brought to our family in her brief time with us. I talked about how some losses are so profound that they change you forever, and how the people who love you either support you through those changes or reveal themselves to be unworthy of your trust. Throughout the service, I kept thinking about Mark's words. Personal desires have to take a backseat to professional responsibilities. As if saying goodbye to my goddaughter was a selfish indulgence rather than a fundamental human obligation. That night, sitting in Carmen's living room while she slept fitfully upstairs, I made my decision. Mark Stevens had shown me exactly who he was, and it was time to show him exactly what that kind of person deserved. I drove back to Phoenix Friday morning and went straight to the Morrison Project review. Mark seemed surprised to see me, but pleased that I'd made the right choice by prioritizing work over family. The meeting went perfectly. We secured the $12 million contract, and Mark took full credit for the successful presentation. "Outstanding work today, David," he said afterward, his tone magnanimous. "This is what separates professionals from amateurs. You understood what was really important. I nodded and smiled, already planning his destruction. Friday afternoon, I drove to an electronics store and bought a prepaid phone with cash. No contract, no identification required, no way to trace it back to me. The kind of phone people buy when they want to communicate anonymously. I already knew Mark's phone password. He'd entered it in front of me dozens of times. His wedding anniversary, 0823, apparently seeing no irony in using the date he married Linda to protect communications with his mistress. I'd also memorized Linda's phone number from the company contact list that included emergency information for all employees' families. The plan was simple, elegant, and completely untraceable. Send Linda a text from an anonymous number, giving her Mark's phone password and suggesting she check his messages. Let Mark's own words and Jessica's responses tell the story. No accusations from me, no need to explain how I knew, just the truth delivered directly from the source. But I waited until Monday to send the message. I wanted Mark to enjoy his weekend first, to spend Saturday and Sunday feeling satisfied with his successful manipulation of both his professional and personal life. I wanted him to believe he'd gotten away with everything, denying me bereavement leave, securing the Morrison contract, and maintaining his secret affair without consequences. Monday morning, I sent the text at exactly 9:47 a.m. during our weekly staff meeting when Mark's phone would be sitting on the conference table in front of him. Hi, Linda. You don't know me, but I know about your husband's affair with Jessica Morrison from his office. His phone password is 0823. Check his messages from the last 3 months. You deserve to know the truth. I watched Mark's face as the meeting continued, waiting for the moment when everything would change. It took exactly 17 minutes. Mark's phone buzzed with a call from Linda. He glanced at the screen, smiled slightly, and declined the call, probably assuming it was something routine about their kids' schedules or weekend plans. The phone buzzed again 2 minutes later. Mark declined again, but this time he looked slightly annoyed. The third call came 3 minutes after that, and this time Mark answered with the irritated tone of someone whose wife wasn't respecting his work schedule. Linda, I'm in a meeting. Can this wait until... He stopped talking. His face went white, then red, then white again. Everyone in the conference room could hear Linda's voice through the phone, though we couldn't make out the words. What we could hear was the tone, angry, hurt, and getting louder with each sentence. Linda, calm down. I don't know what you're talking about. Someone what? Give you my password. That's impossible. Someone's playing a prank or... More shouting from Linda's end. Mark's hand was shaking now, and sweat was forming on his forehead despite the air conditioning. We'll discuss this at home. I can't... Linda, please don't do anything rash. Just wait until I get home, and we can talk about this rationally. The call ended abruptly. Mark stared at his phone for several seconds, then looked around the conference room as if suddenly remembering that 8 other people had just witnessed his world falling apart. Sorry about that, he said, his voice artificially calm. Family emergency. We'll need to continue this meeting tomorrow. Everyone filed out quietly, exchanging glances but saying nothing. Mark remained seated at the conference table, staring at his phone like it might explode. I was the last person to leave, and as I reached the door, I heard him make another call. Jessica, don't talk, just listen. Something's happened. Someone told Linda about us. I don't know how or who, but she knows. She has my phone password somehow. You need to delete everything from your phone right now, and we can't see each other for a while. Maybe never. I'm sorry, but my marriage... I have to try to save my marriage. I closed the door softly and returned to my desk, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and something darker that I didn't want to examine too closely. Mark Stevens was about to learn that actions have consequences, and that the people you hurt might be more capable of retaliation than you assumed. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Mark left the office at 10:30 a.m. and didn't return for the rest of the week. According to office gossip, Linda had confronted him at home with printed copies of his text messages with Jessica, along with hotel receipts she'd found by going through his credit card statements. The confrontation had been explosive enough that neighbors called the police, thinking someone was being attacked. Jessica stopped coming to work Wednesday, officially taking personal leave, but actually avoiding the humiliation of facing colleagues who now knew about her affair with a married father of two. The Morrison contract, the same contract Mark had used to justify denying my bereavement leave, was quietly transferred to another project manager after Jessica's father learned about her relationship with Mark and decided that Meridian Construction was no longer a company he wanted to do business with. Mark returned to work the following Monday looking like he'd aged 5 years in 1 week. He moved through the office like a ghost, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when directly addressed. The confident swagger that had defined his management style was completely gone, replaced by the hollow expression of someone whose carefully constructed life had collapsed without warning. The divorce proceedings were messy and public. Linda hired an aggressive attorney who subpoenaed Mark's phone records, email accounts, and credit card statements. The affair with Jessica was documented in excruciating detail, along with evidence that Mark had used company resources to facilitate the relationship. Linda was awarded full custody of their sons, the house in Scottsdale, and 60% of Mark's assets, including his retirement accounts and stock options. But the professional consequences were equally devastating. The company's HR department launched an investigation into Mark's relationship with Jessica, uncovering a pattern of inappropriate behavior that included sexual harassment complaints from 2 other female employees who'd been too afraid to speak up. Mark was terminated for cause, forfeiting his severance package and his vested stock options. The final insult came when Mark's replacement was announced. The new construction manager was David Martinez, me. Apparently, my handling of the Morrison project, before it was canceled, had impressed upper management, and my reputation for reliability and professionalism made me the obvious choice for promotion. The irony was perfect. Mark's refusal to let me attend my goddaughter's funeral had led directly to his own professional and personal destruction, while simultaneously creating the opportunity for my advancement. His selfishness had become the catalyst for his own downfall. I never told anyone about the anonymous text message. As far as everyone knew, Linda had discovered the affair on her own. Maybe through suspicious behavior, maybe through another anonymous tip, maybe through simple intuition. The truth remained safely buried with the prepaid phone I'd thrown into a construction site dumpster the day after sending the message. 6 months later, I was managing the same projects Mark had once controlled, earning 20% more than he'd ever made, and working for a company that had implemented new policies about work-life balance and bereavement leave. The Morrison contract was eventually replaced by an even larger project with a client who specifically requested to work with me based on my reputation for integrity and reliability. I used my first big bonus to establish a college fund for Carmen's future children whenever she was ready to try again. The fund was named in Sophia's memory, ensuring that something positive would come from the tragedy that had started everything. As for Mark Stevens, I heard he eventually found work with a smaller construction firm in Flagstaff, earning half his previous salary and living in a studio apartment, while most of his paycheck went to child support and alimony. He'd remarried a woman he'd met online who didn't know about his history with Jessica or the circumstances of his divorce. I felt no sympathy for him, He'd had everything: a successful career, a beautiful family, the respect of his colleagues, and he'd thrown it all away for an affair with an employee young enough to be his daughter. When my family needed me most, he'd chosen his golf weekend over basic human decency. When Linda needed to know the truth about her marriage, I'd simply provided the tools for her to discover it herself. Sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate planning or dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's just giving people the information they need to make informed decisions about who deserves their trust and loyalty. Mark had taught me that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. He'd just never imagined that lesson would apply to him. The burner phone had cost $30 and destroyed a man's entire life. Not because I was cruel or vindictive, but because Mark Stevens had revealed himself to be the kind of person who prioritizes personal convenience over human decency, and such people eventually face consequences for their choices. Sophia's funeral had lasted 2 hours. Mark's marriage had lasted 15 years. In the end, both had ended the same way, with people learning to live with permanent loss because of someone else's selfishness. The difference was that Sophia was mourned by people who loved her, while Mark was forgotten by people who'd simply stopped caring about his excuses. Some lessons are harder than others, but they all get learned eventually.